Keith Richards is 80 and death has stopped returning his calls. Madison Square Garden, October 2024. The lights go amber, smoke swirls, and he shuffles on stage like a ghost who refuses to stay buried. The first riff of Start Me Up splits the room like lightning. 60 years of muscle memory, mistakes, and miracles compressed into one dirty, perfect sound. The crowd roars, not because he looks good, not because he moves well, but because he's here. Still here. Somehow, impossibly, immortality with nicotine breath and a Fender Telecaster. Can you cheat death by playing louder than it? This is Keith Richards' story. Not the sanitized version. Not the myth. But the real, messy, improbable truth of a man who discovered that the secret to immortality might just be forgetting you're supposed to die. To understand how Keith became Keith, how a working-class kid from Dartford became the living embodiment of rock and roll's refusal to behave or expire, we need to go back to the beginning. To a train platform in 1961 where two boys who'd known each other briefly in primary school ran into each other by accident and changed music history. He was born Keith Richards on December 18, 1943 in Dartford, Kent. His father, Bert Richards, was a factory worker. His mother, Doris, worked various jobs to help make ends meet. They lived in a council house, modest and respectable, in a town that had been bombed during the war and was slowly rebuilding itself into something that looked like normalcy. Young Keith was not destined for greatness by any external measure. He was small, skinny, not particularly athletic or academic. What he had was his grandfather's love of music. Gus Dupree, his mother's father, who played guitar and saxophone and filled Keith's early childhood with the sound of jazz and big band music. When Gus died, he left Keith his guitar. He didn't choose the guitar. It chose him the moment the world ran out of words. At Dartford Technical School, Keith was unremarkable. He drew constantly, had a talent for art that might have led somewhere if music hadn't intervened. He was quiet, kept to himself, didn't cause trouble or attract much attention. Just another working-class kid in post-war England, destined probably for a factory job or an apprenticeship, a life of routine and modest ambition. But then he discovered American blues, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. Music that was raw, sexual, dangerous in ways that British culture in the early 1960s couldn't accommodate. Music that sounded like freedom, like possibility, like everything his gray Dartford existence wasn't. He started playing guitar seriously. Not lessons, he couldn't afford those, but by ear, by feel, learning the blues progressions that would become the foundation of everything he'd ever play. Music became less something he did and more something he was. Not a hobby, but an identity, a way of understanding himself in the world. In 1961, on the platform at Dartford Station, Keith ran into Michael Jagger, Mick, from primary school. Mick was carrying a stack of records under his arm, blues records, Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, the same music Keith was obsessed with. They started talking, realized they were chasing the same sound, the same dream. Within months, they were playing together. Within a year, they'd formed a band. If Keith was fire, Mick was oxygen. One couldn't burn without the other. The Rolling Stones were born in 1962. Not as a commercial calculation, but as an obsession, a commitment to bringing American blues to British kids who had no idea what they were missing. Brian Jones was the initial leader, the most talented musician. Ian Stewart on piano, Charlie Watts on drums, Bill Wyman on bass. And at the center of it all, the partnership between Mick and Keith, the front man and the riff master, the face and the heart. From the beginning, Keith understood something about rock and roll that many musicians miss. It's not about technical perfection. It's about feeling, about rhythm, about creating a groove that gets into people's bodies and makes them move. His guitar playing wasn't flashy. He didn't do solos that showed off how many notes he could play per second. Instead, he created riffs, simple, repetitive, hypnotic progressions that became the backbone of songs. The most famous riff of all time came to him in his sleep. May 1965, a hotel room in Florida. Keith woke up in the middle of the night with a guitar line in his head. Half asleep, he reached for the cassette recorder he kept by the bed, played the riff, muttered "Dancer" into the microphone, the working title for what would become Satisfaction, then fell back asleep. He wrote the sound of frustration and accidentally invented immortality. The best songs come when you're too tired to lie. In the morning, he woke up, played back the tape. That riff, that insistent, grinding, perfect riff that would define not just a song but an entire era, was followed by 45 minutes of him snoring. He'd created rock's most iconic guitar line, then immediately forgotten about it and gone back to sleep. That's very Keith. Genius arriving not through discipline or calculation, but through something more instinctive, more mysterious. Music as a kind of sleepwalking, a channeling of something that came through him rather than from him. Satisfaction changed everything. It was a #1 hit around the world. It established the Stones not as Beatles imitators, but as something darker, more dangerous, more sexual. And it confirmed Keith's role in the band. He was the sound. Mick was the image, the sexuality, the controversy. But Keith was the rhythm section, the heartbeat, the musical core that everything else was built around. Through the mid to late 1960s, the Stones defined themselves against the Beatles. Where the Beatles were charming and accessible, the Stones were threatening. Where the Beatles sang about holding hands, the Stones sang about spending the night together. It was a carefully constructed opposition, the respectable boys versus the bad boys. But it worked because it reflected something real about both bands' musical sensibilities. And Keith embraced his role as the bad boy, started dressing more outrageously, let his hair grow long and wild, began experimenting with drugs, not just marijuana, which was becoming common in the music scene, but harder stuff. LSD, speed, and eventually heroin. The drugs were partly recreational, partly creative. Many artists of that era believed that altered consciousness led to better art, that you had to break down the barriers of normal perception to access something more authentic. And for a while, maybe it worked. The Stones' late 60s output, Paint It Black, Sympathy for the Devil, Gimme Shelter, had a darkness and complexity that their earlier work lacked. But drugs also exact a cost, and for Keith that cost would almost be his life. Through the 1970s, Keith descended into heroin addiction. Not casual use, but full-blown dependency, the kind that reorients your entire existence around obtaining and using the drug. He would nod off mid-conversation, miss recording sessions, show up to gigs so wasted he could barely stand, let alone play. Even when the veins went dry, the riffs kept bleeding. And yet, this is the mystery at the heart of Keith Richards. He could still play. Even at his most destroyed, even when he looked like a corpse propped up against a guitar when his fingers hit the strings, something magical happened. The riffs were still there. The groove was still there. However much he was destroying himself, the music remained intact. Anita Pallenberg was with him through much of this period, a German-Italian actress and model who'd been with Brian Jones before leaving him for Keith in 1967. She was beautiful, chaotic, dangerous. The most dangerous woman I ever met, Keith would later say. They had 3 children together, Marlon, Angela, who died as an infant, and Tara. The relationship was passionate and toxic, fueled by mutual addiction and a lifestyle that would have killed most people. In 1977, Keith was arrested in Toronto for heroin possession. The charges were serious enough that he faced 7 years in prison. For most musicians, this would have been career-ending. For Keith, it was a wake-up call. He went through detox, cleaned up enough to avoid prison. The judge gave him a suspended sentence on the condition that he perform a benefit concert for the blind, and emerged somehow intact on the other side. He didn't quit drugs. He just switched dealers from heroin to adrenaline. "I'm not addicted to drugs," he told the arresting officers. "I'm addicted to freedom." It was a Keith line, provocative, defiant, with just enough truth to sting. Because what he was really addicted to was the music, the performance, the life. Drugs were just fuel for the engine, and when they started threatening the engine itself, he proved he could let them go. The 1978 album Some Girls marked Keith's return. Not just to functionality, but to brilliance. The album was raw, immediate, some of the best music the Stones had made in years. Keith was clean, or clean enough, and focused in a way he hadn't been for a decade. He'd stared into the abyss had stared back, and somehow Keith had won the staring contest. Through the 1980s and 90s, Keith settled into something approaching stability. He married Patty Hansen in 1983, his first marriage, at 40. They had 2 daughters, Alexandra and Theodora. He continued using drugs recreationally but never returned to the full addiction of the 70s. He learned to function, to maintain, to be present for his children in ways he hadn't been for Marlon. Patty was different from the other women in Keith's life. She wasn't a fellow addict or a muse or a partner in chaos. She was grounded, stable, someone who loved Keith but refused to enable his worst impulses. When they met, she was a successful model. She didn't need his fame or his money. She just wanted him, the actual person underneath the mythology. Their relationship worked precisely because Patty established boundaries. She wouldn't tolerate the worst of the behavior that Anita had endured. If Keith disappeared for days on a bender, he'd come home to find his bags packed. If he missed important family events, there were consequences. Not drama, not screaming fights, but quiet, firm accountability. And somehow, impossibly, Keith responded to this. The man who'd spent his entire life rejecting authority accepted it from Patty because it came with love rather than control. "She saved my life," Keith said once matter-of-factly. "Not through intervention or ultimatum, but by giving me something worth staying alive for." Their daughters grew up in relative stability. Keith in his 40s and 50s was still Keith, still wild, still unpredictable, but also more grounded, more available. He cooked for them, read to them, was present in ways he couldn't have been during the heroin years. Not a perfect father. Keith Richards as a perfect anything is an impossibility, but a father who tried, who cared, who showed up. His relationship with Mick remained complicated. They were brothers, partners, co-creators of one of the most successful bands in history. But they were also opposites in ways that created constant friction. Mick was disciplined, health-conscious, business-minded. Keith was chaos excess, art for art's sake. Mick thought about the brand, the empire, the legacy. Keith thought about the next riff, the next show, the feeling of being on stage with his guitar. The arguments were legendary. About money, Keith thought Mick was too focused on profit margins. About touring, Mick wanted shorter, more profitable runs. Keith wanted to play as long as people would listen. About control, Mick ran the business side. Keith resented any interference with the music. They would go months without speaking, communicating only through intermediaries, through lawyers, through passive-aggressive comments in interviews. But then they'd get in a room together, plug in, and the magic would return. Keith's guitar would find that groove. Mick's voice would lock into it, and suddenly 60 years of resentment and rivalry would dissolve into pure music. That's the thing about Keith and Mick. They need each other in ways that transcend friendship or even love. They're musically married, bound together by something deeper than any personal grievance could break. Keith was chaos. "I was management," Mick would later say. It was true, but it was also reductive, because Keith's chaos had its own logic, its own discipline. You don't survive 60 years of rock and roll excess by being purely destructive. You survive by understanding your limits, by knowing exactly how far you can push before you break. And Keith, for all his apparent recklessness, had always known where that line was. The closest he came to crossing it was in the late 1970s, right before the Toronto arrest. There are stories from this period that sound apocryphal but are apparently true. Keith nodding off mid-sentence, cigarette burning down to his fingers. Keith falling asleep standing up, guitar still in hand. Keith so far gone that roadies had to physically position his fingers on the frets before shows. Muscle memory taking over once the first chord sounded. One night in Paris, after a particularly bad nod, he woke up in a bathtub full of ice water. His band and crew standing around him like mourners at a wake. They'd thought he was dead. His lips had been blue, his breathing barely detectable. Someone, Keith never found out who, had the presence of mind to fill the tub with ice, shock his system back to consciousness. When he came to, sputtering and furious, his first words were, "Did we finish the session?" They had not. Keith stumbled back to the studio, dripping wet, picked up his guitar, and laid down the track they'd been working on. Perfect first take. Then he went back to the hotel and slept for 18 hours. It's the kind of story that sounds like myth-making, like the exaggeration that accumulates around famous people. But multiple witnesses confirmed it happened, and it captures something essential about Keith in that era. The absolute priority of the music, the refusal to let even near death interfere with the work. Addiction might have controlled his body, but the riffs were immune, protected by some part of his brain that drugs couldn't touch. In 2006, Keith fell out of a coconut tree in Fiji. He was 62 years old, on vacation between tour dates, and apparently thought climbing a palm tree was a reasonable activity. He fell, suffered a subdural hematoma, bleeding in the brain, and required emergency surgery. The Stones tour had to be postponed. The media went into a frenzy. This was it. Keith Richards was finally done, felled not by drugs or alcohol, but by a coconut tree, which seemed appropriately absurd. But Keith recovered, and the first thing witnesses reported seeing when he woke up in the recovery room was Keith reaching for a cigarette. You can't kill Keith Richards. Not with drugs, not with trees. Probably not with anything short of a direct nuclear strike, and even then you'd want to check the crater just to be sure. The mythology around Keith's survival has become its own phenomenon. Jokes about how Keith will survive the apocalypse, how he's actually been dead since 1974 but no one told him, how he's some kind of undead creature who feeds on guitar riffs and cigarette smoke. Keith encourages these jokes, leans into them because they're based on something true. His survival is genuinely remarkable, genuinely inexplicable by normal standards. In 2010, Keith published his autobiography, Life, co-written with James Fox. The book was extraordinary, frank, funny, insightful, and in places surprisingly tender. But it also caused the biggest rift in Keith's relationship with Mick since the 70s heroin years. Keith didn't hold back. He called Mick vain, controlling, obsessed with money. And in one passage that became instantly infamous, he described Mick's penis as small and suggested that Mick's constant pursuit of women was compensation. It was petty, juvenile, and devastating, not just because it was published for millions to read, but because it came from Keith, the one person whose opinion Mick actually cared about. For months they didn't speak. The Stones' future seemed genuinely in doubt. Tours were postponed. Business meetings happened without both of them in the room. The silence between them was louder than any argument had ever been. But music, as always, proved stronger than ego. They had a concert scheduled in London. Neither wanted to cancel. Too much money at stake. Too many disappointed fans. So they showed up, didn't speak before the show, walked on stage from opposite sides, and then Keith hit the opening riff of Start Me Up, and Mick started moving, and the decades of shared muscle memory took over. After the show, backstage, they still didn't speak directly. But Keith passed Mick a beer. Mick took it. And that was the beginning of reconciliation. Not apologies, not explanations, but the simple acknowledgement that they couldn't do this without each other. That the Stones needed both of them, that the music they made together was more important than any personal grievance. Mick's the best frontman alive, and the worst roommate, Keith would say years later, the closest he'd come to acknowledging both the love and the exasperation that defined their relationship. Through his 70s, Keith continued performing, continued recording, continued being Keith. He appeared in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies playing Captain Teague, father to Johnny Depp's Jack Sparrow, a role that existed because Depp had based his performance on Keith's mannerisms and swagger. Keith treated the whole thing with amused detachment, showing up to set, doing his scenes, not taking it too seriously because nothing except music had ever been that serious to him. His body forgot youth, his hands never did. His guitar collection had grown enormous over the decades. Dozens of instruments, each with its own history, its own sound. But his favorite, his true companion, was a 1953 Fender Telecaster he'd named Macabre, after the character in David Copperfield. Macabre had been with him since 1971. Every major Stones recording and performance for 5 decades had featured that guitar. It was scratched, battered, held together partly by faith and partly by duct tape, like Keith himself. People often ask about Keith's influences, his guitar heroes. Chuck Berry above all, the man who taught Keith what rock and roll rhythm guitar could be, who showed him that you didn't need fancy solos, you just needed groove. When Keith met Chuck Berry, his hero, his idol, Chuck slapped him for touching his guitar without permission. "I was blessed by his right hand," Keith said later, laughing. Because even getting hit by Chuck Berry was an honor, was proof that he'd made it into that sacred circle of musicians who understood what the blues was really about. The blues has always been Keith's true religion. Not Christianity, though he was raised nominally Anglican. Not drug culture, though he participated enthusiastically. But the blues, that music born from suffering and survival, from Black Americans who turned oppression into art. Keith has always acknowledged his debt to those originators, has always been clear that white British boys like him were students, borrowers, translators of a tradition they didn't create. He didn't steal from the blues, he prayed in its language. "When you play the blues, you're confessing," he wrote in his journal in 1972. "I just never stopped confessing." And maybe that's the key to Keith Richards. He's a confession made flesh, a man who turned his entire life into an extended blues song about survival and stubbornness and refusing to give up even when giving up would be so much easier. His autobiography was titled Life for a reason. Not because his life was exemplary or admirable in conventional ways, but because he'd lived it fully, completely, without apology or restraint. He treated sin like a sacrament and still came out blessed. Every quote sounds like a joke until you realize it's scripture. At 80, Keith Richards is one of the last survivors of his generation. Brian Jones died in 1969, Jimi Hendrix in 1970, Janis Joplin the same year, Jim Morrison in 1971. On and on the list of musicians who burned too bright and died too young. Keith burned just as bright, used just as hard, pushed himself just as far. But somehow he's still here. He's not lucky. He's rehearsed survival longer than anyone alive. "I've outlived my heroes and my dealers," he said in a 1997 interview. It was meant as a joke, but like most Keith jokes, it contained uncomfortable truth. He'd watched almost everyone from his era die or fade away. The dealers who'd supplied him through the 70s were long gone. The musicians he'd idolized as a young man were mostly dead. And Keith kept going, kept playing, kept surviving. "To be old is to have survived being young," he wrote in Life. It's one of his most quotable lines and one of his truest. Because Keith's survival isn't passive. It's not luck or good genes. It's a kind of stubborn refusal to accept limits. An insistence that as long as he can still play, as long as he can still hit that riff, death will just have to wait. The discipline of chaos is something Keith has mastered in ways that Mick never understood. Mick runs 6 miles a day, does yoga, maintains his body like a machine. Keith smokes, drinks, eats whatever he wants. But Keith's discipline is different, subtler. It's about knowing exactly how far you can push, about understanding your own system well enough to know what it can handle. It's about maintaining the groove even when everything else is falling apart. Keep playing, he told the band at Altamont in 1969, when a man was being murdered just feet from the stage, when chaos was overwhelming the festival, when the smart thing would have been to stop, to acknowledge that they'd lost control. Keep playing. It's the only thing we know how to fix chaos with, and they did keep playing. And somehow that impossible, stubborn refusal to stop, even when stopping was the only sane option, has defined Keith's entire career, entire life. When everything's falling apart, when you're at your lowest, when death seems not just possible but probable, you keep playing. You hit the next riff. You survive into the next song. The mythology has become so large that it sometimes obscures the reality. Keith Richards, the immortal rock god. Keith Richards, the human cockroach who will survive the apocalypse. But underneath the mythology is a simpler truth. Keith Richards is a man who loves music more than he fears death, who found something in rhythm and blues that gave him a reason to keep going even when every sensible reason said stop. His children, 5 in total with 3 different women, have complicated relationships with him. Marlon, his eldest son, has spoken publicly about the chaos of growing up with Keith and Anita in the 70s, about being a child in a house where drugs and danger were constants. But he's also spoken about Keith's love, his commitment to being present when he could be, his determination to be a better father than his own father had been. Keith's youngest daughters, Alexandra and Theodora, grew up in relative stability. Keith in his 40s and 50s was still Keith, still wild, still unpredictable, but also more grounded, more available. He cooked for them, read to them, was present in ways he couldn't have been during the heroin years. Not a perfect father. Keith Richards as a perfect anything is an impossibility, but a father who tried, who cared, who showed up. In his house in Connecticut, Keith has a music room. Guitars line the walls. There's recording equipment, photos of heroes, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, Robert Johnson. And in the corner, a well-worn armchair where Keith sits and plays, sometimes for hours, just him and whatever guitar he's picked up that day. It's where he's happiest, friends say. Not on stage in front of thousands, though he loves that too. But alone with his guitar, working out a riff, chasing a sound he's had in his head since he was 15 years old in Dartford, listening to Muddy Waters and dreaming of something larger than his gray English town could contain. Music is a language the devil taught me to pray in, he said. It's a perfect Keith quote, blasphemous, poetic, true. Because for Keith, music has always been sacred, even when, especially when, it was wrapped in the trappings of debauchery and destruction. The music redeemed everything else, made sense of the chaos, gave meaning to the madness. At 80, Keith still tours with the Stones, still performs those same songs he's been playing for 60 years. Satisfaction, Jumpin' Jack Flash, Brown Sugar. Songs that have been played so many times they should be meaningless, should have lost all their power through repetition. But when Keith hits that opening riff, when his fingers find those familiar frets, the songs come alive again. Because Keith still means it, still feels it, still believes in the power of a perfect riff to change a room, a mood, a life. The Rolling Stones don't age. We calcify, he said. It's funny, but it's also defensive, because of course they age. Keith ages. His face has become increasingly skeletal, his body increasingly fragile. He's had health scares beyond the coconut tree, pneumonia, broken ribs, various infections and ailments that would hospitalize a normal person for weeks but send Keith home after a day or two because he doesn't have time to be sick. But the calcification line suggests something else too. That aging for Keith isn't about decay but about consolidation, about becoming more essentially yourself. The Keith Richards of 2024 is not so different from the Keith Richards of 1964. A little slower, certainly, a little more careful, but fundamentally the same. A man devoted to rhythm and blues, to his guitar, to the belief that as long as you can still play, you're still alive. When asked what he's afraid of now at 80, Keith doesn't hesitate. Only running out of riffs, not death, not old age, not irrelevance, but the creative exhaustion that would mean he had nothing left to say musically, that the well had finally run dry. Because for Keith, death would be losing the music. As long as he can still play, he's immortal. The relationship between Keith and Mick has settled into something that looks like peace from the outside, but probably still contains all the old tensions underneath. They've been partners for over 60 years. Married couples rarely last that long. They've fought, reconciled, fought again, reconciled again. The pattern is established, probably permanent, but underneath the fights and reconciliations is something unbreakable. The music they make together, the chemistry that exists when Mick's voice and Keith's guitar intertwine, creating something neither could make alone. He's impossible, infuriating, and completely essential, Mick said recently, in one of his rare moments of genuine candor about Keith. It could serve as Keith's epitaph, except he's not planning on needing an epitaph anytime soon. The concerts continue. The tours roll on. Keith walks on stage, cigarette lit, guitar slung low, looking like death warmed over and served with a side of whiskey. And then he plays, and the years fall away. And for 2 hours, he's not an 80-year-old survivor. He's that kid from Dartford who discovered Chuck Berry and decided to dedicate his life to rhythm and blues. In Keith's world, there's a guitar named Macabre that's been his companion longer than any human. There's a stack of journals filled with observations about music, life, survival. There's a kitchen where he cooks his famous guitar stew, a metaphor if there ever was one, throwing whatever's available into a pot and hoping it comes out edible. There are grandchildren now, a whole generation who know Keith not as a rock god but as granddad, who plays guitar and tells stories and smokes too much. And there's the music, always the music, the reason for everything else, the justification for all the excess and destruction and survival. Because however Keith lived, whatever damage he did to himself and others, he also created beauty. Those riffs, Satisfaction, Start Me Up, Brown Sugar, dozens more, are embedded in our cultural consciousness, soundtrack to 60 years of other people's lives. If you're going to get wasted beautifully, Keith said once. It's been taken as encouragement for excess, but it's actually about aesthetics, about making sure that however you live, you create something of value. Keith got wasted, certainly, but he also got beautiful, in his own damaged, skeletal, impossible way. The lights come up at Madison Square Garden. The show's over. Keith unplugs his guitar, lights a fresh cigarette, walks off stage. Tomorrow they'll do it again in Boston, then Philadelphia. Then on, the tour that seems like it will never end because Keith Richards doesn't know how to stop. Doesn't see a reason to stop as long as his fingers still work and crowds still come to hear those riffs. One day silence will catch up, but until then noise is mercy. Backstage he drinks water, sometimes just to confuse his liver. He talks with the band, with crew members, with the few journalists granted access. He's funny, sharp, more intelligent than his image suggests. He reads constantly, history, literature, anything that catches his interest. He's not just a guitar player. He's a man who's lived, who's thought, who's turned his experiences into something approaching wisdom. But mostly he's a man who plays guitar. That's the core of everything else. The rest, the survival, the mythology, the impossible longevity is footnote. The riff is the point. Someone asks Keith if he ever thinks about retiring, about finally stepping away from the Stones and the touring and the endless cycle of performance. He looks at them like they've suggested he stop breathing. I'm not immortal, he says, I just forget to die. It's a joke, mostly. but it's also the truth at the heart of Keith Richards. He survived this long not through discipline or healthy living or any conventional approach to longevity. He survived by being too busy with music to pay attention to death, by forgetting that he's supposed to slow down, give up, fade away. The guitar goes back in its case. Macabre, battered, and beloved, ready for the next show. Keith heads to the tour bus or the hotel or wherever rock stars in their 80s go after concerts. He'll sleep a few hours, wake up, do it all again. Because the blues doesn't end. It fades into the next bar. And Keith never learned how to stop mid-song. Because that's what Keith Richards does. He plays, he survives, he continues. Not through any particular virtue or merit, but through sheer stubborn refusal to accept that there's any other option. And when he finally does die, someday, eventually probably, the world will be shocked. Because Keith Richards dying seems impossible, a violation of natural law. He's supposed to go on forever, the ultimate survivor, proof that rock and roll will never die because Keith Richards refuses to let it. But until then, there's another riff to play, another show to perform, another reason to forget that mortality is supposed to apply to everyone, even guitar players from Dartford who discovered American blues and decided to make it their religion. Is survival still rebellion when death has given up? When chaos becomes discipline, is there any sin left to confess? And if the music outlives the man, was he ever mortal at all?